So, Lone Rider here, and I just wanted to throw out there a question for any other cyclists out there. When is too much too much? The reason is, so I was at the store today and I happened to see a road bike action magazine. And there's various cycling themed magazines that have existed over the years. This happens to be one of them. And I was glancing at the cover, trying to decide whether it was worth buying the magazine based on the price. I mean, after all, we have the internet, but I like print publications, and I do like the idea of keeping them in business. And it's nice to be able to, sit in your easy chair and look at something that you can actually hold in your hand if you want to, peruse articles on cycling at the end of a long day, rather than, sitting there staring at a screen and going blind, right? I mean, yeah, technology's great, but there's something really cool and visceral about print, at least to me. Your mileage may vary. So I was thinking about buying this, and I looked at it, and that's when I saw on the cover, holy crap, they're talking about a 12-speed Campagnolo. And I was like, okay. Now, for those who aren't familiar with road bike gearing, when you say 10-speed, 11-speed, 12-speed, you're talking about the number of gears in the back. But this gets a little confusing because there's typically a minimum of 2 gears in the front, possibly 3 if you have a triple. Nowadays, it tends to be either a standard road double, so 5339, or compact double, which is usually 50, and then your inner ring will be typically a 34 or somewhere thereabouts. When I have a double, I tend to customize it. If it's a compact, typically I change the inner ring to 36 from 34 because I feel like I'm spinning out too often. With the number of gears I have in the back, it never seems like I'm in quite the right gear. So, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. When I started riding, brand new bikes at the time were getting sold with 7 and 8 speed gears in the rear. I was riding mostly secondhand stuff, except for my first store-bought bike, which was a mountain bike. But when I got into road bikes, I could only afford secondhand things. And so the most they ever had was 12 gears. 2 in the front, 6 in the back. Right? That was fine, right? Now, at one point, I started riding bikes with 7 or 8 gears. When I got my first new store-bought road bike, it was 8 gears, and so on and so forth. And 8-speed tended to be, for me, as far as I was concerned, 8-speed was fine. 9-speed was nice in some ways, but 8 or 9-speed, it could have stayed there, and I would have been perfectly satisfied with that. 8 or 9-speed in the rear on my modern road bikes, and on vintage stuff, 5 or 6 gears in the back, so either 10 speeds total or 12 speeds total. And I would have been perfectly happy with that. Except the industry decided, nope, we want you to have 10 gears in the back, then 11 gears, and now apparently it's 12. So it used to get confusing when you'd say 10-speed Shimano or 10-speed Campagnolo or whatever, because the problem was, once upon a time, when bikes only had 5 gears in the back and 2 in the front, your entire drivetrain was 10-speed. In other words, that was the total number of gears, not just the number of gears in the back on the rear wheel. So, when someone would say 10-speed, the question is, are they talking about a modern 20-speed drivetrain that has 10 gears on the rear wheel? Or are they talking about an actual 10-speed from, let's say, 1972 or something? Good question, right? And it got confusing. You had to basically determine from context, or, it would get to the point where people would say 6-speed when talking about the older gears, or 5-speed when talking about the older gears, and then 10-speed when talking about the newer stuff. And so it became clear that that was the number of gears on the back. Here's the problem. Well, first of all, this was never usually a huge thing for avid cyclists, because when we hear 10 speed, we know you're talking about a bike that only has 5 gears in the back. But the problem is it did get confusing. Now it's got even more confusing. It's gotten to the point where the entire drivetrain of a bike that, let's say, I would have grown up with from the 1980s with 6 gears can fit on the rear wheel of that modern bike. The modern bike has as many gears in its rear wheel with this 12-speed as an entire bike that I grew up riding had as a combination of the front and rear gears. I mean, I get why people love these things. Technological advancement, hello. And if you're a competitor, if you're racing, or if you're riding at the top level, I guess there's an advantage to having, anything you can that will be your competitor, right? Here's the thing. I get for like pro racers why it's important. They're all at more or less the same level of fitness. They've all had more or less the same training, and any little difference in the equipment on their bike is going to give them therefore an advantage, because physically they're all pretty much at the same level. My problem is this doesn't just stay with the racers. It trickles down into the general market. And, it's not that you can't get 8-speed parts anymore. It's that you're not going to find any high-end 8-speed parts. It's not that you're not going to get high-end 9-speed parts, or you can't get 9-speed parts, but it's harder to get high-end 9-speed parts, right? If you want to buy a bike that has mid-range or higher gearing, it's going to have at least 10-speed, probably 11 now. I don't have a problem with that if the gearing suited what I'm doing. But it doesn't. I was happy with 8 or 9-speed. Frankly, I mean, I've gone on 100-kilometer rides on 20-year-old bikes that only have 6 gears in the back, 12 gears total. My old Bianchi was one of those. I don't understand why the average consumer would need or want 12 gears on the back of their bicycle. And the problem is, the more you break down the gearing, the more you limit the usefulness of each one of those gears, because you're taking an overall range of gearing and you're just divvying it up into more finite increments. So the problem for me isn't that I think this is just rampant consumerism and why would anybody need that? No. As far as I'm concerned, if you want 12 gears on your bike, go out and buy them. Hell, buy 12 gold-plated gears as far as I'm concerned. I don't really give a crap what somebody has on their bike. Whether or not I think they need it. That's the kind of argument every ignorant prick uses when they try to tell somebody else what they can and can't do, right? Or you don't need that. Why do you need such a thing? No, I don't care whether somebody needs it or even thinks they need it. They want to buy it, it's their right. More power to them. Let them go and buy 12-speed gearing. But I wish at the same time the bicycle industry would consider that there are those of us who've been riding for a long time, who still ride, who ride in real-world conditions, on open streets, with traffic, who are not professional racers, who are not on a closed course, who are riding year-round on our bicycles that we have to buy and maintain. And that more narrow gears, more narrow chains, different gear spacing, etc., makes these things more prone to wear out, more prone to cross-chaining, more prone to problems, drop chains even, when master links fail or special pins fail. I saw 2 of those some years ago now, maybe about 2009, on guys who were riding, one guy was riding 10-speed, one guy was riding 11-speed. And in the previous 5 years, I had ridden with the same people, sometimes up to, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles a year, and I had never seen a drop chain on anybody in terms of a chain physically coming off the bike. But once people started using more, now you could say, well, maybe they just need to maintain their stuff more. Okay, so what you're admitting is that it doesn't last as long, that it has less longevity, which is a problem for people riding in real world conditions, especially when they have to buy their own gear, right? I mean, a guy who's on a professional racing team, he's got a team mechanic. He's got some guy who calls Doc who runs out onto the road to help him if he gets hurt. He has a car following him around with spare wheels on the roof. What do we have? Quarters or a cell phone, depending on where you are, to call for help if you break down and you can't fix it, and a toolkit under your pouch under your seat so that hopefully you can, in fact, fix it if you break down in the middle of farm country where the nearest intersection, let alone the nearest occupied house, is 5-10 miles down the road, if you're lucky. Yeah. I don't know about you. If I'm buying my own equipment and I'm having to maintain it, I want something I want a balance between having a mechanical advantage, having some kind of newfangled option, and having stuff that's just going to last long and be sturdy. And the one thing we know is to cram more gears in there without drastically altering the spacing on the road bike frames. They have to alter the spacing on the gears, so you lose compatibility with pre-existing parts. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. You lose longevity. It makes the bike more prone to cross-chaining and the chain skipping, because if you're in one gear in the front and then the other gear in the back, it's now at much more of an extreme angle because there's just more gears. There's a lot of things, 8, 9, maybe 10 speed. Fine. Leave the 11 speed for the racers and 12 speed for the racers, whatever. But no, what happens is once they develop it, it has to trickle down into the parts groups that are sold to the regular people on the market. And I kind of understand why. The groups it trickles down into first are the higher end groups, the groups that will be part spec'd on a racing level frame or a high end level frame. If you're going to buy a high quality bike, it's going to come with high end parts. So it's going to have Campy Record or Shimano Ultegra or Dura-Ace or something, right? And it will get to the point where, but back in like 2012 or 13 or whatever, when I bought my Raleigh Refinio, that bike came with 10 speed in the rear and compact gearing in the front. That bike was Shimano 105. Okay? 105. Essentially an upper entry-level, low mid-range group. I mean, I consider 105 perfectly fine. It's not flashy, but there's nothing wrong with it. But most avid cyclists wouldn't call this high-end. Yet, comes with the new 10-speed, which at the time was becoming the new standard. So, the problem here, it's not like, yeah, somebody's racing, they'll have a use for that sort of thing. If somebody just wants to spend money on bling, let them. Who cares whether they need it or not? It's their money, they can buy whatever they want. But my problem as a cyclist is I want to be able to buy what I want, what I need to keep my bikes maintained and have that available on the market. And as the industry standard becomes essentially a standard that's really only useful for racers and people at a high competitive level, those of us who are riding on the street on our own bikes that we have to maintain and are happy with existing gearing are finding that we're either going to have to buy heavier, clunkier, and cheaper gears if we want 8 or 9 speed, or we're going to have to upgrade to the new stuff that has gear ratios that are confusing, that we don't like, where we're always skipping between gears because we never feel like we're in the right gear, that cost more, that wear out sooner, that sometimes suffer catastrophic failure dropping a chain on the road, that are more prone to cross-chaining, and that basically, it's like, for us, it's all the negatives and there's no positives, right? And I don't know, maybe you just have to have been riding a long time to be able to feel when you never feel like you're in the right gear. But over rolling terrain, I felt, if I was just doing like hilly terrain all the time, climbs and whatnot, that 10-speed gearing would have been fine in conjunction with the compact. But over rolling terrain or fast, flat terrain with a handful of maybe slight hills, I felt like I was always skipping back and forth. And it's because you take the range of gears and you divide them up into smaller increments. Each of those is only useful for a shorter range of RPM. And again, maybe not everybody's going to notice this. I happen to have been riding for a long time. I notice it. So, I see this magazine and I'm like, it's like 12-speed Campy, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my, what is the world coming to? Not because 12-speed Campy isn't an awesome thing. From a technological standpoint, it's awesome. It's really cool. It's neat. But from my standpoint as a rider, it's also one more reminder that it's going to be harder to get and maintain the parts I need to keep my bikes on the road without, just looking at the secondary used market, which I guess is always a thing. But, Jesus, it's nice to, have stuff that works. And for me, again, 11 speed doesn't work. 10 speed is a little bit of overkill. I could make do with it if I had to, but I really prefer 9 speed or 8 speed, And it's been a learning curve to realize this, because when I couldn't afford anything with 10 speed, and everybody else was getting it, I felt left out. They have this awesome new thing that I don't. But when I finally got a bike with 10 speed, I was like, I don't like this. I was like, this is not cool for me. This is not for me. And, it's not. Now, the good thing is bikes are easy to work on. You can take them apart. You can swap parts. Bikes are kind of like guitars. Anybody can learn how to work on them, but it's really, really difficult to get good at it. And in that sense, yeah, you could always take parts off old bikes, bikes you find somebody throwing away or buy on Craigslist just as a parts bike, if you can get it cheap. And there you go. You have your access to parts. But again, they're going to be used parts, and the drivetrain typically wears out on a bike in a year or two if you're riding a lot. Sometimes less than a year, depending on how much you're riding. And the truth is that, for most recreational riders, they're not going to wear out their drivetrain. But way back when I was a little bit thinner, I did. I bought a bike, and about a year later, everything started skipping. The chain was all messed up. I'd already gone through one chain, but it's like the gears were wearing out on the back and everything. And my friend who runs the bike shop was riding with me today that it was really skipping bad. And I said, dude, you sold me a crummy bike. I was joking, right? And he goes, no. I sold you a good bike. You just ride a lot. And I was like, oh, well, what am I going to have to do to fix it? And he explained the drivetrains wear out. So the problem with depending on the secondary market for drivetrains, when you're looking at higher-end components, who buys higher-end components? Two types of people. Freds, so-called, who buy really nice stuff and don't ride it, or hardcore riders, right? Avid cyclists. The number of avid cyclists, I don't really know where it stands compared to the number of Freds, but chances are, if somebody's going to drop, a lot of money on a rear cassette, they're an avid rider. They're going to ride the bike that has that cassette on it. What does that mean? It's going to get pretty worn. So relying on the secondary market for high-end stuff is basically consigning yourself to stuff that's going to come to you basically pre-damaged. Whereas low-end stuff, somebody might buy the bike, thinking they're going to get into cycling and then never really do it, so they've only ridden it a couple times. The drivetrain might be essentially brand new except for some dust. A bike with high-end parts is much more likely to have been ridden, again, unless it's bought by a friend. And how much, what are you looking at? You're looking at a drivetrain that might have, 6 months left in it or 2 months left in it if you're lucky. Is it worth it to buy a used bike, take the parts off, swap them? Now, there's secondary market for new old stock too, but trust me, as stuff gets harder to find, that's going to demand a premium. So what is the person who's not necessarily a collector or running a bike museum, but who simply wants to keep their bikes in working order and ride them as they do get older? What are you supposed to do? Riddle me that, Batman. So basically, when is too much too much? I understand why people like the idea of 12-speed. I think it's kind of neat. I think it's kind of awesome. But all I could think of when I saw that was, oh my God, here we go again. It's like, I just want to keep my bikes on the road. On Rider out.